Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is and you're watching this webinar. Thanks for taking the time to watch this webinar on the special education eligibility process. We really hope that you find it useful. So we are attorneys with the Education Law Program at Council for Children's Rights. I'm Haley Lampkin-Blythe, and presenting with me today is Stephanie Klitsch, who is the Assistant Director of our program. So just a note before we get started that the information we're providing today is just for educational purposes. So it is not legal advice. So what do we do at the Education Law Program? Before we jump into the content of this webinar, we just wanted to share a little bit of information about the Education Law Program in general. So the Education Law Program has 4 main focuses. First, through our education advocacy for individual families, we provide individual representation for students and their legal guardians in need of legal assistance regarding special education, Section 504 plans, and school discipline. Families that are interested in legal representation, they can contact us either through our Get Help email address, or they can call us at 704-943-9609 for assistance. Secondly, we also have navigation services. We work with students involved in the juvenile court system in Mecklenburg County through this service. And this service addresses issues related to students' education rights by identifying current education issues and providing detailed recommendations for how to resolve those concerns. And referrals for this service can be made through our ELP email address, or by calling 704-943-9611. Third, we're also focusing on systemic educational issues. So we cannot individually serve all students in our community who may need our services, of course. So instead, we're strategically elevating issues that we know might have a broader impact on students in our community. And then lastly, we provide free community trainings on topics related to education advocacy. So in addition to this, our First Wednesday series, we also provide training to parent groups and community groups by request. So here is our agenda for this webinar. We'll go over just some preliminary information, and then we'll focus specifically on the content related to special education eligibility process. So we will be discussing identifying the need for special education services, making an initial referral for a special education evaluation, the evaluation process, how eligibility determinations are made, and the initial IEP document. So just 3 quick notes before we get started. We like to go over a few terms that we'll be using throughout the presentation. So special education, AKA, there are many, many acronyms that we use when we're discussing special education. And sometimes the terms mean the same thing, which can be confusing. So we want you to understand that students who receive special education have an individualized education program, an IEP, but they're also referred to as exceptional children, or EC students. And EC is a North Carolina specific term. So ultimately, the thing to know is that when we're talking about EC services, IEP services, or special education, we're talking about the same services, and all of those terms might be used interchangeably and can be used interchangeably. The second term we really want to drive home is special education decision maker, or SEDM. So the special education maker, or the SEDM, is a term you'll hear us use throughout this presentation. And we're going to use this term, SEDM, instead of using the term parent. And let me explain why to you. So SEDM is an umbrella term that incorporates all of the different people that might be making special education decisions for a student. So for the majority of students, it's their biological or adoptive parents who are going to be making special education decisions for them. But for some students, it's a bit more complicated. So for students that live with non-parent legal guardians or students that are in the foster care system, the special education decision maker might not be their parent. Other options include a non-therapeutic foster parent, former guardians, kinship placements, district-assigned surrogate parents, or court-appointed special education decision makers. The thing to know is that the SEDM is the person legally acting as the student's parent for the purposes of special education decisions. This is the person who requests the EC evaluations, who consents to EC, and has the right to pursue dispute resolution strategies. So again, while for most students, this special education decision maker will be their parent, we're going to use the term SEDM to be inclusive of all possible parties who might be making special education decisions on behalf of students. And then the last quick note is about charter schools. So some families, of course, choose to send their students to charter schools instead of to typical public school districts. And charter schools are public schools authorized by the State Board of Education and operated by independent nonprofit board of directors. So everything that we will discuss in this training applies to charter schools as well as to traditional public school districts. Charter schools must follow special education law, Section 504 law, and follow NC law on school discipline. We mention this because too often we learn of situations where charter schools are telling families that they do not need to comply with these laws. So we want to make it clear that students have the same rights in charter schools as they do in public school districts. Okay, so next we're going to do just a brief overview of the different types of education interventions. And we like to begin the trainings with these slides so that everyone is aware of what we mean when we talk about terms like IEP and Section 504 plan. Okay, so this graphic helps us to take a step back and understand what types of services are available to different groups of students. So the largest circle, incorporates all students, whether or not they have a disability. So any student who is struggling academically or behaviorally in school can receive extra assistance. In North Carolina, this extra assistance is through something called the Multi-Tiered System of Support, or MTSS. And you do not need a disability in order to receive support through MTSS. But in order to fall into either of the smaller two circles, a student must have a qualifying disability. The bigger of the two circles is Section 504. And as we'll learn a little later on, more students with disabilities fall under Section 504 than fall under special education. And so special education is the smallest circle because it has the most stringent eligibility requirements. So more on multi-tiered systems of support. As I mentioned, MTSS is available to any student, whether or not they have a disability. And it's intended to provide extra support and interventions to students with additional needs. MTSS involves different tiers of supports. So all students are considered to be on Tier 1, and that means they have access to high quality instruction. And then at Tier 2, students with identified academic or behavioral needs receive some small group interventions. And Tier 3 then is the highest tier of MTSS. And at this tier, students receive more intensive and more individualized supports. So some key components of MTSS. A key component of MTSS is universal screening. And this is intended to identify students who need supplemental support. So by the time a student gets to Tier 3, they should be receiving evidence-based interventions to respond to their specific needs. And progress monitoring is a part of MTSS as well. So this means that there are specific goals that an intervention is intended to address, and that data is regularly taken to the students are making progress towards those goals. And so families really need to be aware when their student is on a tier 2 or a tier 3 plan, and they should actively participate in that process. There are generally MTSS meetings to review the student's progress, and the family should attend those meetings if they can, and ask to get regular updates based on the progress monitoring data. And then finally, the MTSS team can make a referral to special education if they believe the student may qualify for an IEP. So who gets special education? We're going to talk briefly about who qualifies for special education services, which is the smallest circle from the graphic from a few slides back. So in order for a student to receive special education services, there are 3 criteria. The student must first be between the ages of 3 and 21. Secondly, they must meet the criteria for at least one of 14 disability eligibility categories. So in North Carolina, each eligibility category has specific requirements that must be shown in order for the student to fall under that category. So for instance, a diagnosis of autism by itself does not necessarily mean that a student will automatically be eligible for an IEP under the autism eligibility category. The third criteria is that the student must have a disability that adversely affects their educational performance and requires specially designed instruction. And I want to point out here that educational performance is broader than just academic performance. So a student can be advancing from grade to grade and have passing scores in their classes, but still be eligible for special education. Educational performance also includes things like social interaction and behavioral needs. So it's much broader than educational performance. So as I just mentioned, there are 14 disability eligibility categories in North Carolina. So here is a list of all 14, and we will discuss these categories in a bit more detail later in the presentation. So what is an IEP? IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. And the P in IEP stands for program, not plan. We always try to point that out. And that's because an IEP incorporates all of the services that a special education student receives. The IEP document itself is very long. It's generally at least 15 pages. It's very detailed, and included in the IEP document are things like the student's strengths and weaknesses and needs, measurable goals for the students to achieve in the course of 1 year, the accommodations, related services, and specially designed instruction necessary to help the student reach their IEP goals, and then where the services will be provided. And when I say where the services will be provided, this does not mean the actual location. For example, Myers Park High School versus West Charlotte High School. Instead, this refers to whether the student will receive their services with their non-disabled peers, or instead, if the student will receive their services in a setting with only other students with disabilities. So for many students, it ends up being a combination of these options. The IEP document is developed by the IEP team, and the IEP team must include the special education decision maker. A quick note here that all special education students are entitled to something called a free appropriate public education, or a FAPE, another one of those acronyms. And really all you need to know for now is that FAPE is a legal standard that requires all students' IEPs be sufficient for the student to achieve reasonable educational progress. So an IEP versus a Section 504 plan. We often get questions about the difference between IEPs and Section 504 plans. And as I've said, all students who receive special education services have an IEP. Students with IEPs receive some amount of specially designed instruction with a special education teacher. And what specially designed instruction means is that they're adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of the instruction to meet the unique needs of a student that results from the student's disabilities. A Section 504 accommodation plan, however, are for students with disabilities whose needs do not rise to the level of requiring specially designed instruction from a special education teacher, excuse me. So these students receive all of their instruction in a regular education environment, but they receive accommodations that their general education teacher can implement to allow the student to have access to their education. Also, as we mentioned before, Section 504 has a broader definition of disability. So more students will qualify under Section 504 than will qualify for special education. That's why the Section 504 circle in the graphic was bigger than the special education circle. But it's important to note that if a student has an IEP, then they do not require a Section 504 plan, because everything that would be on the Section 504 plan would also be incorporated into the IEP. So I know sometimes that can still be a little confusing, so hopefully an example can help illustrate the difference between an IEP and a Section 504 plan. So I'll just read this example to you. So Sam has a specific learning disability. His IEP provides services with a special education teacher several times a week to address his individual goals in reading, writing, math, and organization. He also receives modified assignments, extended time on tests, and takes tests in a room with fewer students. On the other hand, Erin has severe myopia, which is nearsightedness. Her Section 504 plan requires seating near the teacher or the board and all printed materials presented in a larger font so she can read them. So as you can see, Erin does not have any special education services or any individual goals like Sam has. But also Sam does receive some accommodations and modifications that, if those were all he needed, could be on a Section 504 plan instead of on an IEP. And those accommodations and modifications are modified assignments, extended time on tests, and taking tests in a separate setting. So now that we've discussed the differences, here are also some similarities between IEPs and Section 504 plans. So first, they're both required to be reviewed annually. These meetings are generally called annual review meetings. And these are really very important meetings for families to attend. And also, while there's only one meeting required each year for IEPs and for Section 504 plans, families can request an IEP meeting or a Section 504 meeting at any time during the school year. And then lastly, IEP teams and Section 504 teams can spend hours and hours drafting a beautiful, perfect document, but if it's not actually implemented, then it's basically worthless. So it's really critical for families to follow up with the teachers to make sure that these services, accommodations, and modifications are actually being provided as written. I will turn it over to my colleague, Stephanie.
Thanks, Haley. Now that we have a bit of background information, we're going to discuss how a student becomes eligible for special education. The first step in the eligibility process is to identify which students are in need of special education services. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, the federal special education law, imposes a child find duty on school districts and charter schools. School districts and charter schools must have policies and procedures in place so that students who need special education are identified and evaluated. School districts and charter schools must be especially alert to make sure they identify homeless students, students in foster care, migrant students, and even students enrolled in private schools who need special education. Any school employee working with a student is required to notify the school principal or special education director if they believe that the student has a disability impacting the student's education. The principal should then contact the SEDM and request consent to begin the evaluation process. The child find process is one that we find generally does not work as well as we would like. The MTSS process is one way in which districts work to identify students who may need special education services. As students get older, however, it is generally their family that requests an evaluation from the school rather than it being initiated by the school district. Here are some red flags that may indicate that a student may need special education services: failing grades or test scores, trouble reading, writing, or doing math, repeated behavior problems in school, trouble concentrating or paying attention in school, trouble listening to others or expressing themselves, mental health or emotional issues that impact school performance. We're now going to talk about the process for referring a student for a special education evaluation. This process can be initiated by the school system through the child find process or by a request from the SEDM. When a family believes that a student may need special education services, the SEDM must request a special education evaluation in writing. While all important communication to the school should be in writing, it is especially critical here that this request is put in writing. As we will discuss on the next slide, once that written communication is received, a timeline begins which dictates how quickly the student must be evaluated. We often hear from families that say they have asked for an IEP for their student and nothing ever happened. Our first question always is whether the request was made in writing. Often we find that that did not happen. There's no magic language that needs to be included in the request. However, it is helpful when it indicates why the SEDM believes that special education may be needed. The written request for an evaluation should be sent to the student's principal, teacher, and/or other school professional. We suggest sending it to more than one person to be sure that it is received. This is easy to do with email when you can send it to multiple people at once. Larger districts like Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools have someone at each school assigned to be the EC compliance facilitator. This is the person in charge of IEP paperwork and compliance at the school. The SEDM can call a school to find out who that person is and include that person on the request to be sure that it is received. It is very important to keep a dated copy of this request. This is another added benefit of using email because you automatically get a copy of your sent email. I strongly suggest that you create a folder in your email where you save important communications about your student with the school. One of your handouts is A Parent's Guide to Special Education in North Carolina. On page 117, you can see a sample special education referral letter. We have also included a blank EC referral letter in the materials that can be used to make the request. Once the school receives the written request for a special education evaluation for a student, a 90-day timeline starts. Within those 90 days, the school must do the following things. First, they must decide whether to evaluate the student. This decision happens in an IEP team meeting. I will discuss what happens at these IEP meetings in the next slides. Next, they must complete all of the evaluations. Then it is determined whether the student is eligible. This also happens in an IEP meeting. If the student is eligible, the IEP team then develops the initial IEP. And lastly, the student must begin receiving services. All of those items must be completed within 90 calendar days, not school days. It is also important to understand that the 90-day timeline does not stop for holidays or summer vacation. Therefore, an SEDM could request a special education evaluation for their student on the last day of school, and this process would have to occur during the summer. We generally do not suggest doing that, but it is important to know it is possible. Too often we hear from families that when trying to request an IEP for their student in the spring of a school year, School staff say, oh, it's too late in this year to request one, and they should ask at the beginning of the next school year. This is simply not the case. Once the SCDM requests an IEP for their student, the school will schedule an initial referral IEP meeting. It is at this meeting that the IEP team will decide whether to move forward with evaluating the student. Information is gathered on a specific form called the Special Education Referral Form, which we will walk you through in the next several slides. You can find this form on the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, DPI's, Exceptional Children Division's website. It is also included in your handouts for this presentation. It is useful for families and advocates to review the form in advance and even try to fill it out with the information about the student you want included. During the meeting, the IEP team discusses the student's strengths, areas of concern, and past assessment information. All of this information is used to determine whether the student will be evaluated, and if so, what evaluations will be conducted. If the student has received any evaluations outside of school, it is generally helpful to provide that information to the IEP team so that the information can be included in the decision-making process. SEDM should send that information in advance so that the school members of the IEP team have a chance to review it and incorporate the information during the meeting. We find that it is helpful to walk through the special education referral form in detail to help prepare for what to expect at the initial referral IEP meeting. At the top of the form, you'll see the date the meeting is being held, as well as the date the school received the written referral request for special education services. Make sure this date is correct. It should not be the date of the meeting, but instead the date when the SEDM submitted the written request, such as the date the SEDM sent the email. It is important that the electronic system has this date correct because that is the start of the 90-day timeline, not the meeting. The referral source box should include the name of the person who made the referral. If the referral was made by the MTSS team, for example, it may say MTSS team. As we mentioned before, however, most often in the referral source would be the SEDM. The referral source position box might say staff, parent, foster parent, surrogate parent, etc., depending on who made the referral. The next section is an important one, discussion of students' strengths. While a special education referral is often made due to education concerns, we want to be sure that we are also highlighting the student's strengths. The strengths listed should be specific to the skills of the student in relationship to their non-disabled peers. All students have strengths. If the school members of the IEP team are spending a long time discussing the student's strengths, this may be an indication that the IEP team is planning to emphasize the student's strengths, minimize the concerns, and state that the student does not need to be evaluated. Part of why we'd like to go through this form in such detail is because we want you to know the flow of the meeting to help you plan your advocacy. The next section of the special education referral form involves a review of the student's existing data by the IEP team members. This data should include the results of local and state assessments, past and current grades, and documentation of the scientific research-based interventions implemented to address the targeted academic, behavioral, and/or functional areas of need. If the student has already been through Tier 2 or Tier 3 of MTSS, the results of those interventions should be included here. The section also provides an opportunity to document any formal evaluation results provided to the IEP team by the SEDM. The school is required to consider the data and information from evaluations provided by the SEDM when making its eligibility determination. There's also an opportunity in this section for the SEDM to provide information in relation to the student's academic, functional, behavioral performance at home. This is very important data to include. It gives the school team valuable information about the student's performance that may not have been observed in the school environment. It is also the first opportunity in the meeting to lay out what your concerns are for the student. When preparing for the meeting, I suggest taking time to write out detailed notes for yourself about your concerns to make sure that they are all included in this section. The existing observational data collected section of the form should be a narrative of any pre-existing observations. Once there is a suspicion of a disability, informed SEDM consent is needed for further observations to be conducted in regard to the student's suspected disability. As I will show you more on upcoming slides, this form changed a couple of years ago. As you saw on the first page, there are individual boxes to discuss the student's strengths across all areas. It used to be that the form would prompt the IEP team to discuss in detail the areas of concern in each subject. That is no longer the case. The form has the IEP team spend quite a bit of time on strengths. The questions that are meant to elicit the areas of concern are less clear. The first question on this slide is an example of that. It asks the IEP team for additional observational data provided by teachers, administrators, and other relevant school staff in relation to the student's current academic, functional, and behavioral performance at school. These observations are very valuable insights into the student's present level of performance. Here's a common scenario that illustrates my concern. Let's say that an SEDM referred a student primarily for concerns about how the student has been doing in their math and science classes. The math teacher has contacted the family about the student's behavior in the class and the student falling behind on assignments. The science teacher has emailed that the student will fall asleep in class. Then at the IEP meeting, the teacher present is the reading teacher, not math or science. The reading teacher only has good things to say about the student, and no one has collected feedback from the math or science teachers. Here is where preparation can really pay off. In advance of the meeting, you can do things like contacting the teachers in the math and science classes and ask them to write up their concerns. You can print and bring to the meeting those previous emails from the teachers. You can contact the EC case manager in advance and specifically ask that they request feedback from all of the students' teachers in preparation for the meeting. You could even ask for the math and science teachers to be allowed to briefly come to the meeting to share their experiences. Without knowing how important this question is, however, these opportunities would be missed and the form would not reflect the actual concerns. The form also provides space for any additional information to be added from other sources, such as information about absences, tardies, suspensions, mobility rates, out-of-state IEPs, and medical information. Make sure that this information is filled out completely and accurately. Often, information in these sections is drafted before the meeting. You do not want them to gloss over the answers they have drafted. Read them closely and let them know what else should be written. This form is completed before formal required evaluations of the student's suspected eligibility categories are conducted. Nevertheless, in this section of the form, the IEP team should document a summary of the existing data for the student. As previously mentioned, any new assessments beyond this existing data will require SEDM consent. This is a screenshot of a page from the old form that I mentioned a couple slides ago. On the next slide, I will show you what the current form says, and you can see the significant difference between them. What I appreciate about this section of the old form was how it prompted the IEP team to go through each area and determine what are the areas of concern. It is detailed enough for the team to talk about specific skills within academic areas such as language arts and math. Since most SEDMs are not educators, all they may know is that their student is struggling in reading, but may not know the difference between things like phonemic awareness and reading fluency. This form prompted those discussions, and the specific areas mentioned are the ones that will be tested. In your handouts for this presentation is a copy of this page. Use it to prepare for the meeting. Check off the areas that you are concerned about and use that terminology when discussing your concerns. Here is what the current form asks in terms of the areas of concern. As you can see, it does not provide any prompts for the team to go through all possible areas of concern. You want to bring up all of your areas of concern and why you are concerned. The school district must evaluate the student in all areas of suspected eligibility. You're going to hear us say that a lot. The entire meeting has been leading to this moment. Now the IEP team determines whether the student will be evaluated for special education services. The IEP team might determine that no evaluations will be conducted based on the review of existing data and determine that the student is not eligible for special education services. The IEP team must explain its decision not to evaluate the student for special education services. Alternatively, at this point, the IEP team may determine that the existing evaluation data provided to the IEP team is sufficient to find the student eligible for special education and related services. This means that all the required evaluations for the suspected disability category have been conducted and are both current and relevant to support the decision that the student is a student with a disability. In this case, no additional evaluations are required to be conducted to determine eligibility for special education services. This is not the typical situation. Most often, the IEP team determines that it must conduct initial evaluations for the student and that eligibility cannot be determined based on a review of the existing data alone. When this option is selected, an evaluation plan must be created and consent must be obtained from the SEDM to conduct additional evaluations. Next, the IEP team must check the box for all areas of suspected disability for the student. You can see that all 14 eligibility categories are listed here. North Carolina requires specific evaluations be conducted based on the student's suspected eligibility categories. So the school district must check a box for each required evaluation that will be conducted based on the student's suspected eligibility category. All screenings and evaluations that are checked off in this form must also be included in the informed parental consent form for the SEDM to sign. One of the most important things to understand about the evaluation process is that the student must be evaluated in all areas of suspected disability. We have discussed how there are 14 different disability eligibility categories. The IEP team does not simply choose the one that they think the student is most likely eligible under. Instead, they must consider all possible eligibility categories that may apply based on the student's presenting needs. For instance, let's say that a student has been diagnosed with ADHD. The student is failing math and is also getting in trouble a lot. It would be reasonable for the IEP team in this situation to suspect that the student may be eligible under 3 different categories. Other health impairment. This is the category where the student has a medical diagnosis and it impacts their alertness, strength, and/or vitality. Another possible category is emotional disability. This is a category for students who have behavioral or emotional needs that are impacting their ability to learn or relate to others around them. And the last possible category is specific learning disability. The student's struggles in math may be indicating that the student has a specific learning disability in math. Because of this obligation to evaluate in all areas of suspected disability, as we have said, it is critical for the SEDM to raise all areas of concern for the student during the meeting, including behavioral, academic, study skills, and daily living skills. They should let the IEP team know about all diagnoses. To determine if the student is eligible, a variety of assessment tools are used to gather information about the student. Sometimes families hear from school staff that they will not evaluate their student until the student has gone through the MTSS process. This is not correct. If a parent requests an evaluation, it cannot be delayed because the student has not yet been through MTSS. The MTSS interventions can be put in place at the same time that the special education evaluations are occurring. When preparing for the initial referral meeting, you should think through the different eligibility categories that you think may apply to the student. The North Carolina policies governing services for children with disabilities specify the evaluations that are required for each of the 14 eligibility categories. So, based on the categories you think your student may be eligible under, make a list of those required evaluations. After that, think about any additional evaluations that may be important to request based on the student's needs. During the IEP meeting, once the IEP team has agreed to evaluate the student, make sure that the form reflects all of the different suspected eligibility categories and also lists all of the evaluations you want to be conducted. I'm going to turn it over to Haley.
Thank you, Stephanie. So next we're going to talk about what the evaluation process looks like. We do have another presentation that discusses special education evaluations in much more detail if you're interested in learning more about that. So SEDM consent. The special education decision maker must provide consent before evaluations are conducted on the student. And then they must provide consent again before the school begins providing special education services. The SEDM is the only person who can provide this consent. Now we're going to discuss how the IEP team decides which evaluations will be given to a student. So as we've mentioned before, in North Carolina, each of the 14 disability categories has a list of required evaluations. This can be found in the North Carolina policies governing services for children with disabilities. In a moment, we'll look at which evaluations are required based on those policies for a student to be found eligible under the category of other health impairment. But in your handout, we've provided this section of the North Carolina policies governing services for children with disabilities, and you can find that full document on DPI's Exceptional Children's website. And so while there are certain evaluations that are required for each category, that does not mean that those are the only evaluations that can be given to a student. So as we've said, the choice of evaluations is an individualized decision. So here's another example. Imagine a student is suspected of having a specific learning disability. The student's assessments are going to largely focus on academics. But if the student is also having behavioral challenges, the IEP team may also include a behavioral assessment to better understand the student's behavioral needs. Another time when you'll frequently additional evaluations added on to the required ones is when a student may need a related service, such as speech therapy, occupational therapy, or physical therapy. An evaluation must be done before a student will qualify for a related service. So this slide gives us the list of required evaluations under the category of other health impairment, or OHI. This list is pulled directly from those North Carolina policies governing services for children with disabilities. In this list, there are some evaluations that are pretty common across all of the eligibility categories. For example, the hearing screening, vision screening, the research-based interventions, the observations, and an educational evaluation. But something that is different about the list of evaluations for OHI is that it requires a medical evaluation. So once all of the evaluations are conducted, the IEP team is going to meet again to review the results and to determine if the student is eligible. So a quick advocacy tip about reviewing the documentation. One of the best things you can do to prepare for the eligibility determination process is to review the evaluations in detail in advance. So evaluation reports, they're long and they're complicated, and they're just way too much for anyone to digest if they're just seeing it for the first time at the IEP meeting. So we strongly suggest that SEDMs submit a written request to receive the evaluation results in advance of the IEP meeting. If that request is made by the SEDM, the school must provide the evaluation results in advance. The reports might be in draft form, but that still allows the SEDM a chance to review the scores and draft recommendations in advance. If the school does not provide the information in advance, then it may make sense for the SEDM to ask to reschedule the meeting to a time when they can review the results in advance and therefore more meaningfully participate in the meeting. In preparing for the meeting, you should review the reports closely. We'll discuss more on the next slide of some sample questions to ask about the reports. The evaluation results are important for a couple of reasons. First, they help the IEP team determine if the student is eligible for special education services. If the student is eligible, they then help inform all other parts of the IEP, such as goals, related services, accommodations and modifications, and the specially designed instruction that the student may require. So interpreting the results. When you're reviewing the evaluation results, the IEP team must include someone knowledgeable to discuss the results at the meeting. So ideally, the person who conducted the evaluation is also the person at the IEP meeting, but this is not required. Here are some sample questions to ask about the evaluation. It's important to ask questions to better understand what the evaluation results tell you about the student. Ultimately, you want to know what the evaluation results tell the IEP team about the areas where the student struggles and how their instruction may need to be designed to meet their needs. So after all the evaluations are completed, the IEP team then gets together again to determine if the student is eligible for special education. As we mentioned, the student can be eligible in more than one area. And so they can have a primary and a secondary eligibility category. At the eligibility determination meeting, the team will review required criteria for the suspected eligibility categories to determine if the student is eligible. This information, again, is found in the North Carolina policies governing children with disabilities handout that we referenced before. And it's in the same place where you can find the required evaluations for each category. In the next slide, we will look at the required criteria for OHI. So not only must the student meet those criteria, but it must also be shown that the disability does two additional things. It must have a negative impact on the student's educational performance, and the student must require specially designed instruction. Preparation for this meeting is really critical. So when reviewing the evaluation results in advance, you want to be looking for information that shows that the student meets the criteria in the suspected eligibility categories. You also want to look for evidence that the disability has a negative impact on the child's educational performance. As you may remember from the beginning of the presentation, educational performance is broader than simply academics, can include behavioral needs, for example. So you may also want to be able to discuss why the student actually needs specially designed instruction. On this slide are the criteria students must meet to be eligible for special education under the other health impairment OHI category. This information, again, is taken directly from the policies governing services for children with disabilities. So for OHI, this comes down to looking at student strengths, vitality, and alertness. This is a common eligibility category for students who are diagnosed with ADHD. Here's an advocacy tip about outside evaluations. We referred briefly to private evaluations during the discussion of the initial referral eligibility meeting, but that is not the only time that the school must consider those evaluations. So when those outside evaluations are presented by the SEDM, they must be considered at any point, including during eligibility determination, and also once the student has an IEP in place. If a student receives an outside evaluation with a new diagnosis, for example, it may mean that the IEP team should open a reevaluation to determine if any additional information is needed to fully serve the student's needs. If there's any sensitive information about the student or about the student's family that's in that evaluation, then that information can be redacted before sending it to the school. And redacting information sounds complicated, but it can be just as easy as using a black permanent marker and striking through the sentences or paragraphs that you don't want to share with the school district. Independent educational evaluations, or IEEs. IEEs are an important right that special education decision makers have if they disagree with the results or the adequacy of the school district's evaluation. So an IEE is additional testing that's performed by a qualified evaluator who is not employed by the school district. And the school district must either agree to pay for the IEE, or they must file for due process against the special education decision maker to show that their school testing was appropriate. Requesting an IEE is most appropriate when the school evaluation does not accurately reflect the student's skills and deficits, when the school's evaluation is incomplete, or when the SEDM requests an evaluation and the school refuses to do it. So in order to get an IEE, the SEDM should write a letter to the EC case manager expressing disagreement with the school district's evaluation and requesting the IEE. The SEDM is not required to explain why they disagree. However, that can be included in the letter provided to the school. Back to Stephanie.
We are going to briefly discuss the IEP document. We have another presentation that goes through the parts of the IEP in much more detail. If the student is found eligible for special education, the IEP team must also develop the initial IEP within that 90-day timeline. This often happens at the same meeting as the eligibility determination. The initial IEP will address the student's strengths, weaknesses, and needs, measurable goals for the student to achieve over the next calendar year, any modifications, accommodations, related services, and specially designed instruction necessary to help the student reach their IEP goals, and the student's special education placement. Placement is not a physical location. It is determined by the amount of time a student is with non-disabled peers. The student's special education placement will follow along the continuum of placements. These placement options run from least restrictive to most restrictive. The least restrictive placement is the consultation setting. In this setting, the student's special education teacher simply consults with the student's general education teacher. The student is never removed from the general education setting and his non-disabled peers. The next setting on the continuum are inclusion classes. In this setting, the student receives his special education services from a special education teacher, but the student remains in the general education classroom. Inclusion classes are sometimes referred to as co-taught classrooms, as both the general education teacher and special education teacher are present in the classroom, with the special education teacher delivering the specially designed instruction. The next placement setting is the resource level of service, also known as pull-out. In this placement, the student is removed from the general education classroom to receive his special education services from a special education teacher in the special education classroom. If a student is placed in a separate class setting, the student is in a special education classroom for the majority of the day. The student may still be with his non-disabled peers for electives and lunch. A student may also be placed in a separate school setting where all of the students in the school have a disability. The most restrictive setting on the continuum is home or hospital instruction. In this placement, a special education teacher comes to the student's home or to the hospital if the student is hospitalized and delivers the student's specially designed instruction in that setting. These services are generally extremely limited. Schools must offer the least restrictive placement appropriate to the individual student. The law requires that students be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. We know that the eligibility and IEP process can feel overwhelming and daunting, so we like to provide some tips to help navigate through the process. First, don't go alone if you can avoid it. Bring a partner, friend, or other trusted individual. Invite any medical or mental health providers with knowledge of your student. Ask questions and seek clarification throughout the meeting. The SEDM has a right to meaningfully participate in the meeting. That's not possible if you don't understand something that the school team is saying. So don't be afraid to slow things down and get clarity. Make sure everything is written into the IEP documentation. We really can't stress this enough. If it's not in writing, assume it will not happen. Pay extra careful attention to the prior written notice IEP form. This form is completed at the end of the IEP meeting and describes all of the actions that were proposed, refused, and rejected, and why. Everything that occurred at the IEP meeting should be documented on the prior written notice form. If you don't agree with how something is stated on the prior written notice, let the team know what your concerns are and how you believe the information should be documented on the prior written notice. Get copies of all documents before leaving the meeting. We hope the information provided today has been helpful. If you are an SEDM and you believe you may need legal representation related to a special education or school discipline issue, you can contact our team at gethelp@cfcrights.org or call us at 704-943-9609. For court-involved youth, members of the child and family team or a student's juvenile defense attorney can make a referral for our education navigation service by emailing elp@cfcrights.org or by calling 704-943-9611. For training requests, please contact us at elp@cfcrights.org or 704-372-7961. We have provided here some links to some helpful resources, including the NC policies governing services for children with disabilities. Also, please be sure to review the handouts for this presentation. Thank you again for watching.